much appreciate your mentioning that letter that I wrote to the New York Times in support of the young woman who just was brave enough to protest against the war in Iraq before her basketball games. And she was criticized, and I just felt that she needed support. So I wrote her a letter because she's a sociologist, and I said, I don't know if you know who I am, but I just want to let you know that many of us support you and your cause. And she was so right. I'm sorry to make that point, but I appreciate it. There goes the neighborhood. As was pointed out, this presentation is based on my book, co-authored book with Richard Taub of the University of Chicago that was just published by Alfred A. Knopf. And the book is entitled, There Goes Their Neighborhood, Racial, Class, and Ethnic Tensions in Four Chicago Neighborhoods and Their Meaning for America. And it features research that we conducted in Chicago from 1993 to 1996. To be more specific, our study is an investigation into ethnic, racial, and class dynamics in four neighborhoods in Chicago, a city that has experienced a sharp rise in Latino residents. Chicago's Latino population grew by nearly 38% between 1990 and 2000, while its white population declined by almost 15%. White population in the green bars. Whites constituted just 31% of the population in 2000, down from 38% in 1990. And African Americans remain Chicago's largest single group at 36%, but their share of the population had also dropped slightly, as you can see, by almost 2% after rising steadily through most of the 20th century. Now, to fully capture this ethnic diversity, we felt that the most representative neighborhoods would be those that were neither poor nor affluent. We chose neighborhoods that consisted mainly of the working and lower middle classes. Neighborhoods, in short, that best represented ordinary Americans and were more likely to be the destination of outside racial and ethnic groups seeking desirable and affordable places to live. We selected areas that were populated by different ethnic groups to capture possible variation in responses to neighborhood change. And after much preliminary investigation, 4 neighborhoods were selected: Beltway, Dover, Archer Park, and Groveland on Chicago's south and west sides. Beltway was chosen as a white neighborhood, Dover as a white neighborhood in transition, Archer Park as a Latino neighborhood, and Groveland, the African-American neighborhood. Now, because some of the materials used in our study are quite sensitive, the names of these 4 neighborhoods, as well as the names of people quoted in our book, are pseudonyms. Chicago, like several major American metropolitan cities, experienced a number of intense racial eruptions in the second half of the 20th century as working-class whites responded angrily to the civil rights movement, proclaiming that the government's call for integrating schools and residential areas had gone too far. The Democratic promise of equal opportunity rang hollow to these residents, who viewed civil rights as promoting blacks at the expense of the limited financial security that working-class whites had worked hard to achieve. And these ordinary white Americans saw themselves as victims of the government's attempt to legislate a particular way of life in their homes and neighborhoods. Many white Chicago residents noted that integration did not occur at schools for the children of the wealthy and powerful, nor did the elite have to worry about declining property values. These residents also often asked why the government created policies that seemed in their eyes to benefit African Americans alone. For Emily Nolan, who grew up on Chicago's southwest side, there was no question that civil rights time had come. But as a mother and young wife of a Chicago police officer, she watched the battles over busing and housing engulf her neighborhood throughout the 1970s, and she resented that, quote, outsiders, unquote, had targeted law-abiding residents of South Side neighborhoods in their efforts to bring about racial change. Nolan, watching the civil rights marchers come to the Southwest Side, remembered people saying, quote, "Here we are, keeping up our neighborhood and following the rules, living our lives. We're not hurting anyone, and these people from the University of Chicago and Martin Luther King were telling us how to live our lives," she continued. Now, I agreed with what Dr. King was saying, but then here were people coming to our homes and our neighborhoods telling us we had to change things, unquote. Now, with the threat of desegregation, ethnic working class neighborhoods became embattled fortresses. By the late 1970s, many whites had fled these neighborhoods for the suburbs, redrawing racial boundaries as African Americans and later Latinos filled the resulting vacancies. Although most white migrants moved to the suburbs, some relocated to predominantly white working-class neighborhoods in the northwest and southwest sides of the city. During the last 2 decades, Latino entry into southwest neighborhoods of Chicago has further spurred white movement to other neighborhoods and to the suburbs. Now, our investigation was started partly to better understand the factors that produced or prevented what social scientists call the tipping point: rapid ethnic turnover. In many neighborhoods, an infusion of minorities prompted whites to leave and discouraged other whites from replacing them. Thus, the proportion of minority group members grew quickly, particularly after the minority group became a major force in a community. Real estate agents have historically abetted this process by steering purchasers to live within their own kind, quote unquote. Why do some neighborhoods experiencing an in-migration of outside ethnic groups reach the tipping point more quickly than others? And why do other neighborhoods never reach the tipping point at all following an ethnic group's penetration? In addressing such questions, we can reflect on economist Albert Hirschman's theory of exit, voice, and loyalty, a theory that was applied to firms and organizations but is relevant, as we shall soon see, to understanding ethnic change in neighborhoods. Hirschman argues that when people become dissatisfied with changes in their surroundings, they can exit, move, or withdraw from further participation. Or they can exercise voice. Hirschman defines voice as any attempt to change rather than to escape from an undesirable situation. The more willing people are to try to exercise voice, that is, to change, correct, or prevent an undesirable situation, the less likely they are to exit. In situations where both exit and voice options are available, past experience will largely determine whether people overcome their bias in favor of exit, the easier option. The view that a neighborhood is on the path of inexorable change, even when these changes have yet to occur, can trigger an exodus. Indeed, Americans maintain a strong bias toward the exit alternative when confronting ethnic and racial changes. The late sociologist Hubert Blaylock suggested that when minorities penetrate a neighborhood, existing residents are more likely to remain if the new residents bring attractive resources such as high social status, as when in-migrants include actors, sports celebrities, or other highly prized professionals. But such neighborhoods are more affluent to begin with. Minorities who move into neighborhoods populated by ordinary white citizens usually lack high-status social resources. And given that such new residents represent a larger group of people with similar occupational and educational levels and similar language skills, white residents fear that a small trickle could unleash a major invasion. Now, of course, in a democratic society, people are free to move. However, as Blaylock pointed out, some residents might find it too difficult or too expensive to retreat to areas where few or no minorities reside. Thus, when residents view exit as problematic or costly, they are likely to turn instead to voice. And Hirschman offers another explanation for why residents decide to exercise voice. The more they are loyal, that is, attached to an organization, or in this case, a neighborhood, the less likely they are to exit. Loyalty reflects the extent to which residents are willing to trade off the certainty of exit against the uncertainties of improving local conditions. And loyalty becomes particularly important when it reduces the likelihood that the residents most concerned about neighborhood quality will be the first to depart. Such residents tend to be those with superior social resources and more options. They're also likely to be influential. The longer these residents stay, the less likely it is that other residents in the neighborhood will leave. Now, our investigation explored to what extent and why residents in selected urban neighborhoods reacted to looming racial, ethnic, and class changes, and how those actions affected neighborhood stability. How residents reacted in turn reflected the dynamics of ethnic, racial, and class tensions. And a crucial question that we ask in our book is, to what extent are our findings consistent with the assumptions of Hirschman's theory? And in the process, we extended Hirschman's arguments to incorporate the role of neighborhood social organization, as we shall soon see. The neighborhoods of Beltway, Dover, and Archer Park have one attribute in common: a growing Latino population. The neighborhood of Beltway. In 1980, Beltway, a neighborhood of some 22,000 residents, featuring carefully manicured lawn and gardens dotted with statuary, was 95% white. However, by 2000, the white population had declined to 76%, and the Latino population had risen to 21%. Dover. Dover, with almost 45,000 residents, had experienced a remarkable ethnic transformation. In 1980, 83% of the population was white. And in 1990, 60% of the residents were white. Green bars. However, by 2000, the white population had plummeted to 19%. And some 79% of Dover's population was Latino. Indeed, the selection of Dover provided us with the opportunity to observe intergroup tensions in a neighborhood undergoing rapid ethnic change at the time of our research. Archer Park. Archer Park, a once exclusively white and largely bohemian neighborhood, had been a Mexican enclave for several decades. And in 2000, 83% of the residents were Latino. And because its Spanish-speaking population included a high number of recent immigrants, Archer Park was poorer than the other neighborhoods. Yet, even though the Mexicans who arrived in all three of these neighborhoods reported lower incomes on average than the whites they replaced, their influx shored up a sagging real estate market, and the population in these three communities grew despite white flight. Now, because of time constraints, I will not devote much time to a discussion of Archer Park, and will refer to it only when I am contrasting the similarities and differences between these neighborhoods. Groveland. The only one of the four neighborhoods to register a population decline was Groveland, which experienced virtually no rise in its small number of Latinos while losing almost 5% of its overall population since 1990. A community of close to 12,000 residents and neat single-family houses featuring trim yards, in 2000, Groveland was 97% African American and featured a high percentage of long-term residents. Now, in scrutinizing these communities, our study documents the residents' relationships with and perception of other racial and ethnic groups. You see, surveys cannot capture the nuances of behavior and attitude, so our research relied on what we call an ethnographic approach, using researchers trained to record subtle aspects of social and institutional behavior, including informal conversations with residents over extended periods of time. And we captured what sociologists call the contextual aspects of behavior, that is, information on the broader social environment in which the behavior occurs, including background information relevant to the behavior. To investigate the myriad dimensions of ethnic and racial identity, we documented the extent to which the residents of each neighborhood shared modes of behavior and outlook, including values, preferences, aspirations, and worldviews. And we also observed how residents defined and handled collective problems and to what extent they organized to maintain effective social control, for example, curbing deviance in public space, keeping out undesirable populations, channeling public resources toward local collective goals, and so on. Now, the purpose here was to collect data on neighborhood social organization. That's a very important term. Neighborhood social organization, defined as the extent to which the residents of a neighborhood are able to maintain effective social control and realize their common values or common goals. Effective neighborhood social organization depends on residents who collectively supervise community activities, take responsibility for addressing problems, and actively participate in voluntary and formal organizations, including parent-teacher organizations, civic and business groups, and block clubs, churches, and political groups. Our ethnographic team consisted of 9 graduate student research assistants at the University of Chicago who immersed themselves in these neighborhoods for almost 3 years, from January 1993 to September 1995. 3 of the research assistants covered Archer Park, while 2 conducted research in each of the 3 communities of Beltway, Dover, and Groveland. Let me focus first on Beltway. Faced with the options of both ethnic and voice, residents in Beltway have, for the most part, resisted the formal alternative, that is, exit. Many had already exited neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago in response to the growing presence of African Americans. Although high rates of residential stability and racial and class homogeneity have, over the years, provided a solid foundation for neighborhood social organization and the maintenance of social control, they nevertheless worried about the future of their community. Our discussions with Beltwayites revealed that the possible arrival of significant numbers of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians was viewed as a threat to the neighborhood's way of life. Residents saw other neighborhoods change from white ethnic strongholds to minority enclaves, and those transformations were often accompanied by rising rates of crime, declining property values, and the washing away of neighborhood social institutions. As I have already mentioned, the exit possibility does not depend solely on an actual threat. It may also be based on a perceived or potential threat. The frequently held view was that the neighborhood could be in danger if certain developments materialized. Aware that their neighborhood, like many other formerly white enclaves, could be transformed into a haven for minorities, Beltway residents saw their neighborhood as, quote, the last garden spot in Chicago, unquote. That is, the last of the stable white working class neighborhoods. Quote, Beltway is the last stand, unquote, was a popular slogan. It revealed that voice was favored over exit, and there are 2 main reasons for this. The most obvious is that a good percentage of the employed adults in Beltway, roughly a quarter during the period of our research, were on the city payroll. Their employment status required them to live in the city of Chicago. They'd lose their jobs if they moved to the suburbs. Exit, therefore, was not a viable option. Indeed, in terms of neighborhood stability and social amenities, there were no affordable areas in the city for ordinary citizens that constituted a better alternative to Beltway. Furthermore, voice took precedent over exit because Beltwayites were fully aware that the neighborhood's strong foundation for stability provided a more than a reasonable chance to prevent an ethnic turnover. Accordingly, there was intense community pressure to maintain a high level of social organization. Residents reminded one another to work vigilantly to keep the neighborhood strong and thereby reduce the threat of penetration by outside groups. The prevailing view was that if the neighborhood were allowed to deteriorate, some residents would be encouraged to leave. African Americans and Latinos from nearby communities could then fill the resulting vacancies. Residents were called upon, therefore, to keep yards clean, curb gangs, supervise their children, remove graffiti, and work actively to attract new businesses. Beltway's ability to achieve and sustain a relatively high level of social organization over the years could be attributed to several factors, including residential stability, racial and class homogeneity, a network of dense acquaintanceships, extended families, vibrant vibrant community institutions, and powerful connections to the city's political structure. Consequently, the common goal of maintaining stability in the ethnic and racial makeup of the neighborhood was more easily achieved. A strong common belief system also contributed to the social organization of Beltway. Integrating sentiments concerning the adherence to neighborhood standards with patriotism and social conservatism, this belief system helped to generate a sense of what Hirschman calls loyalty. In fact, our field workers found that expressions of loyalty were not uncommon in Beltway. As one married woman emphatically put it, quote, "We're raising our kids here. And I don't know about you, but we ain't going nowhere," unquote. If loyalty reinforces voice and discourages exit, Beltway has benefited from the attachment of many residents to the neighborhood. Nonetheless, despite the expressions of loyalty and vigorous efforts to keep the neighborhood stable, during the 1990s, as you can see, the white population of Beltway decreased 13.5%, while the number of Latinos, the number of minority residents, especially Latinos, increased. Our research was conducted in Beltway during the first half of the 1990s, and the residents were fully aware of the demographic changes in the neighborhood, especially the rise in the number of Latino homeowners. Of the response of residents to the changing face of the neighborhood, 15-year-old Tina Lupinski said, quote, "They think that if one black family gets in, there goes the neighborhood," unquote. Nonetheless, the significant presence of municipal workers who are required to live in the city, combined with Beltway's relatively high level of social organization, might prevent the rapid mass exit of whites that Dover has experienced. The large exit of whites from Dover since 1990 stands in sharp contrast to Beltway's relative stability. Once an area of working-class Eastern European immigrants, Dover has become a Mexican-American enclave. Since 1990, whites have overwhelmingly chosen the exit option and are now represented by only 19% of the population. Rapid social change influences institutional arrangements and patterns of behavior. Not only were the Mexican arrivals younger than the white residents who remain, but also language and cultural differences further separated the groups. During the period of our research, tensions between whites and Latinos simmered beneath the surface and were occasionally vented in public situations, most frequently in conflicts over the use of language, English versus Spanish. If I could just read a paragraph or two from my book. Many Latino residents felt as though language barriers excluded them from community life, while some Eastern European immigrants and their descendants felt that the Mexicans were not trying to learn English. An exchange at one public meeting illustrated the wall of resistance longtime residents had constructed against Latino efforts to include Spanish alongside English in the town's civic and commercial activities. A Latino man in his 30s stood before the microphone in a room filled with at least 100 Dover residents and a handful of local politicians and chastised organizers for not providing material in Spanish. Although an interpreter was translating the proceedings, a community calendar appeared only in English. The man's criticism provoked a wave of audible disagreement from the crowd. A white woman yelled from the back of the crowded room, quote, "This is America," unquote. The man then reiterated his contention that the community should do more to accommodate Spanish-speaking residents who had not yet learned English, an opinion echoed by a Latina sitting in the front row. Signs of commotion swept through the audience, and the white woman fired back, quote, "Well, what about the Poles then?" unquote, referring to the many Polish residents who, in their recollection, had made the painful transition from their native tongue to English without the help requested by the Latino community. Tensions extended beyond differences in language and culture, but those factors certainly contributed to the lack of understanding between both groups. Mexicans, resistant to the dilution of their cultural practices, expressed resentment toward white residents who were generally older and limited in their interaction with the new members of the community. Many whites also argued that the influx of Latinos caused a general rise in crime throughout the neighborhood, further hindering congenial relations. However, these complaints were not accompanied by white actions to resist the ethnic transformation of the neighborhood. In Albert Hirschman's terms, whites resorted to exit, not voice, when they became dissatisfied with changes in their neighborhood. The tipping point that transformed the neighborhood from white ethnic to Latino was reached during the 1990s. The rapid exodus of whites from Dover will very likely continue until they become a negligible percentage of the population. Unlike Beltway, Dover lacked the institutional strength and the population stability to prevent a rapid ethnic turnover. Dover had been struggling through economic decline prior to the en masse arrival of Mexican Americans. Industrial layoffs, coupled with the exodus of many of the more affluent whites to the suburbs, created vacancies that lowered property values. The substantial in-migration of Latinos, many from surrounding Mexican enclaves, reversed this trend by sharply increasing population density and a demand for housing. Business and civic organizations created and run by whites were on the path of decline at the time of our research, largely due to a reluctance or inability to draw participants from the Latino community. Whether an aging or fleeing white population created vacancies, the results was the same. These organizations were withering away. Local churches, on the other hand, had attracted large numbers of Latino members, but cultural clashes led to ethnic divisions that generally resulted in the two groups segregating themselves. Catholic churches conducted masses in Spanish in the morning and English in the afternoon. So the Mexicans and whites had little opportunity to interact. A negligible number of Latinos attended English services, and virtually no whites participated in the Spanish services. None of these developments created situations that encourage whites to remain in or maintain loyalty to the neighborhood and therefore reject the exit option. However, whites and Latinos in Dover did find common ground in their response to African Americans during our research. Latinos in Dover, even the recent migrants, were no more open to living with black Americans than were the white residents. Anti-black sentiment was fueled by concerns over Dover's close proximity to black ghetto neighborhoods that featured high rates of joblessness and the problems that accompany an acute lack of employment. Although Latino enclaves provided a buffer between Dover and the poor African-American neighborhoods, it was at best a thin cushion. Given the proximity to poor black neighborhoods, efforts to prevent the busing of students in overcrowded Dover schools to adjacent poor black neighborhoods presented a rare opportunity for wide-scale white Latino cooperation. Schools then provided a setting for ethnic integration and cooperation as Mexicans and white parents joined forces to pressure officials to build more classrooms in Dover and thus eliminate the practice of busing. Now, in the final analysis, the rapid exodus of whites from Dover will continue. Aside from the cross-ethnic efforts of Dover parents to combat school overcrowding, the exit option has overwhelmed the potential for whites' use of voice, that is, taking steps to correct or address what they perceive to be undesirable changes in a neighborhood. However, despite the substantial decline in the number of white residents during the last decade, the total population of Dover increased from 32 to 45,000 during the same period due to the growth of Latino residents. Indeed, given the overall increase in the Latino population in Chicago, Latino families that leave Dover for other communities will be replaced by other Latino families moving in. And for all these reasons, Dover will remain a Latino enclave for the foreseeable future. Given the burgeoning Latino population's demand for housing, issues of loyalty that were so crucial in maintaining the dominant white population in Beltway were not as important for preserving the Mexican makeup of Dover. Grover. Now, if residential stability was a sign of loyalty to a neighborhood, the residents of Groveland were perhaps the most loyal of our four communities. Relatively few families exited the neighborhood once they arrived. The residential turnover was the lowest among the four neighborhoods in our study. Moreover, in contrast to the palpable racial and ethnic antagonisms in Beltway and Dover and the evident, if not as intense, animosities in Archer Park, ethnic and racial antagonisms in the African-American neighborhood of Groveland were far less obvious. Nonetheless, this lower middle-class black neighborhood continually struggled with the issues associated with being African-American in contemporary U.S. society. Race remained a topic of discussion even though interracial contact within Groveland was minimal. However, although the racial dialogue in Groveland included some anti-white sentiments, it did not reverberate with hostile expressions about other groups so typically seen in statements made by Dover, Beltway, and Archer Park residents. In fact, discussions concerning race overwhelmingly reflected concerns about forging a positive black identity, not with overtly contesting the dominant white population. And several factors accounted for the relatively neutral racial attitudes in Groveland, the greater tolerance in Groveland. Unlike upper middle class African American professionals for whom competition with whites and other groups for coveted positions in private companies and universities has become an obsession, black adults in Groveland face less racial competition for desirable jobs. Many residents held civil service and unionized jobs, such as teacher, bus driver, city infrastructure worker, and park district employee, and federal positions in the post office and Social Security Administration. In fact, in 2000, 27% of the employed population in Groveland worked for the city, state, or federal government. In civil service jobs, especially those obtained through formal tests, racially motivated decisions were much less likely to determine hiring, salary increases, and promotions. Thus, Groveland adults were less likely to feel the slings and arrows of racial slights in workplace settings and to encounter glass ceilings, invisible but impenetrable barriers to better job assignments. Furthermore, since Groveland was a segregated, not an integrated lower middle class community, the involvement or interaction of the residents with whites and other ethnic groups was limited, and the adverse effects of prejudice and other racial indignities were thereby minimized. Finally, Groveland was not experiencing an in-migration of other ethnic groups. Indeed, the combined population of whites, Latinos, and Asians was small and declining. Accordingly, institutions in Groveland were not only firmly controlled by black Americans, there was virtually no ethnic competition for public space and housing. Nonetheless, the fact that ethnicity was not a factor in the day-to-day activities in Groveland did not remove the anxiety of neighborhood change. The residents were concerned about the pressures from surrounding black ghetto neighborhoods. You see, Groveland is an attractive lower middle class community, and the quality of life far exceeded that of the surrounding less economically advanced black communities. Families from nearby poor neighborhoods had begun to trickle in, and their behavior was carefully scrutinized. In block club meetings, residents expressed concern about the future of the neighborhood and what could happen if significant segments of the ghetto poor were able to gain a foothold in the community. Because their community could undergo a class transformation, residents closely scrutinized newcomers. Newer residents often challenged traditions established by older residents, boosting anxiety among the older residents about the neighborhood's future. Commenting on these newer residents, Marion Johnson remarked, quote, "In fact, over the next 5 to 8 years, there's going to be the time the houses are going to be available. And that's when things are going to begin to turn. They're turning now, but they're going to be a real influx of people. I'm not sure in what direction, because, I haven't been too impressed. Just on this street. We've had a couple of people move in, and they're not, they don't understand about block clubs, The block, we have people trying to work on their cars on the street. And this may sound really trivial, but however, if you don't maintain your standards, we have garages and alleys. That's where you do that stuff back there, okay? Unquote. Now, in some respect, the expressions of concern among Groveland residents to the penetration of surrounding lower class blacks into their neighborhood was not dissimilar to the way that whites in Beltway displayed their apprehension about the entry of people of color. The fundamental difference, of course, was that the intergroup anxieties in Groveland represented class, not racial antagonisms. Nonetheless, both neighborhoods were concerned about the impact of outside groups on community stability. Both the white neighborhood of Beltway and the black neighborhood of Groveland feared lower-class populations. Although blacks in Groveland did not express their feelings about lower-class or ghetto blacks in racist terms, and although whites in Beltway were in many respects mixing both race and class antagonisms in their sentiments about the penetration of outsiders into their neighborhoods, both communities were concerned about lower-income populations settling in their neighborhoods and with issues raised by living in close proximity to poor people. Indeed, field notes compiled by our researchers revealed that the residents of each neighborhood expressed concern about renters who did not, in their judgments, share the values of homeowners. Confronted with the option of both exit and voice, Groveland residents seemed to rely on the latter, as they reacted to the behavior of recent residents that sometimes challenged the tradition established by the older residents. Pressure was put on the new residents to conform to neighborhood standards. A key factor in determining the future demographic makeup of Groveland is whether neighborhood loyalty will help reinforce voice and minimize exit if the in-migration from adjacent poor communities increases. What is clear, however, is that Groveland will remain racially segregated regardless of the class composition of the neighborhood. Whereas ethnic separation in the other three neighborhoods reflected a dynamic sifting process as different groups moved in and out, Groveland was unique in the sense that the in-migration was restricted to one group, African Americans. Let me close by saying that our investigations reveal that, ironically, the very same pride in neighborhood identity and strong institutions that hold off the tipping point foster intolerance as a neighborhood defines itself in opposition to other races, ethnicities, classes, and neighborhoods. And this is a central dilemma of urban America. Strong neighborhoods and identities are a double-edged sword. Neighborhoods are stronger if the tendency to exit is reduced and voice and loyalty are strong. But if the residents perceive a threat of an invasion from an outside group, voice and loyalty become effective weapons in preventing significant ethnic or class penetration. In other words, efforts to make or maintain a strong community often create forces that work against the notion of integration in neighborhoods, schools, and overall society that underlies the U.S. ideal. Thus, the very group identity that promotes a strong community both reflects and provokes intergroup tensions. These tensions increase as the neighborhood exhibits signs of change and subside only when the threat of penetration by an outside ethnic group is reduced. Our research has implication for the future of the country. Suburbs and rural areas also define themselves in terms of group identity. So urban areas are no different. However, the most intense intergroup tensions are found in cities. Thus, we need to understand the forces at work in urban areas, both to better comprehend why people react the way they do, and to address a major national challenge, the development of intergroup harmony in an era of rapid ethnic change. Thank you. Time for some questions. One reviewer of the book said, "There's no good news. There's no good news in this book." I guess you can read the book and be somewhat pessimistic about the future of race relations in America. If the goal is to achieve integration, the news is not good. And so one of the things that we argue for in the book is that given the inevitable racial and ethnic separation in urban areas, the need for building multi-ethnic, multiracial coalitions is more important now than ever. In other words, leaders from the various communities would work together and hopefully develop a sense of interdependence, whereby they come to feel that they can't accomplish their goals without the help of other groups. If you don't have a sense of interdependence, a coalition will not get off the ground. It certainly can't be sustained. And so what we call for is for groups to work together, to develop a sense of commonality, to recognize that they have common goals. For example, in the urban areas, everybody's concerned about improving schools, having cleaner and better parks and playgrounds, adequate libraries, police protection, adequate social services ranging from street cleaning to garbage collection, things of this sort. And also, hopefully, if this were possible, these local multiracial coalitions could forge into a sort of a national multiracial coalition and develop the political muscle that is necessary to get the government to restore some of the cuts that they made in the support of cities. 30 years ago, almost 30% of city budgets came from federal funds. Today it's about 5%. And moreover, since the current Bush administration took over, support funds to states have been drastically cut. And that hurts cities because state funds are funneled to cities so that they can have adequate social resources, or resources like street cleaning, garbage collection, so on. And I would like to see more support for cities to make them more desirable places to live so that people would more likely remain rather than exit. Yeah, you know, it's very, very interesting. They played a big role in Dover. And they sort of helped to facilitate the exit of whites from those neighborhoods. But in Beltway, they didn't get off the ground. See, this is Beltway so well organized that they monitored closely the activities of the real estate agents. And our researchers could not find any evidence of real estate agents playing a role in the changes that are occurring in the neighborhoods. Yes? Well, if you focus on the North, for example, say let's take the period from 1870 to around 2000. 1870 to 1900. Particularly 1870s and 1880s. There was notable racial integration in neighborhoods in the North. Racial amity, the likes of which we have not seen. Much more racial cooperation than anything before or since. But that changed after 1900, going into 1910, 1920s, because of the impact of industrialization and urban dislocation, and the migration, significant migration, beginnings of significant migrations of blacks from the South to the North, where they became more visible, and whites perceived them more to be threats. And a lot of blacks were used as strike breakers, which generated a lot of riots and poisoned the interracial atmosphere. The most significant factor was the great migration from the south to the north. If there had not been that great migration, for example, let's say, the South won the Civil War and they succeeded from the Union, and only a small percentage of blacks remained in those neighborhoods. Race relations in the North would be significantly different. Our views toward these blacks, who were quite successful and they were living in integrated neighborhoods and had stable jobs and so on, would compare favorably with the views we have toward Asians. Yes, sir. A lot of the commercial property was owned by businessmen in the communities. Some of their property owned by organizations and individuals who live outside the neighborhoods, but a significant percentage of the properties were owned by people who actually lived there. So the purpose of that question? Yeah, right. And that's especially a problem in a lot of inner city neighborhoods where you have these absentee landlords, and they let the properties run down and so on. That was not the case in the neighborhoods that we observed. I think there were probably more people from outside the neighborhood in control and owning businesses in Dover than in Beltway. But I didn't view that, I don't recall that being a problem. Well, I think Groveland compared favorably with Beltway in terms of the social organization of the neighborhood. Bear in mind, when I talk about social organization of the neighborhood, I'm referring to the extent to which the residents of the neighborhood are able to maintain effective social control and realize their values. And so you would have people, residents involved in the collective supervision of activities in a neighborhood and monitoring social problems in a neighborhood and participating actively in formal and voluntary organizations like parent-teacher clubs, block clubs, political groups, civic and business clubs, and so on. So I think that Groveland and Beltway were quite similar in that respect. Now, it's interesting. You listen very closely. You're quite correct. I did not say much about the Latino organizations in Dover because I don't have a lot of time, and I was trying to focus on why the whites in those neighborhoods, in this neighborhood, why the white population decreased so rapidly. And so I focused mainly on their organizations, and they were withering away. But yeah, many of them were replaced by Latino organizations. Yes? You oftentimes, I mentioned about some of the people concerned about folks working on their cars in the streets, and they were approached. If they were not taking care of their property, residents would come by and talk to them about it. You know, the block club sent delegation around to check and make sure that the neighborhood was maintained. So there's no way that they could live in that neighborhood and not feel the pressure that they knew that they were being observed. Or they would oftentimes call the police, to remove certain cars. Call the police because these people were working on their cars in the streets when that violates the ordinance. And they were quite aware of what was happening in that community. Bear in mind, I said, social organization depends on things like collective monitoring of developments in the neighborhood, and that certainly was true of Groveland. Yes? Well, I haven't done any particular research myself, but certainly there has been some research on that, not a lot. This is occurring, for example, in places like New York City, because of the shortage of affordable housing. And so you create a situation where people want to live within the city, and so they'll move into certain black neighborhoods and buy property. But what happens is, as they move in, as these neighborhoods gentrify, the cost of housing increases, the price of rentals increase, property taxes increase, and end up displacing a lot of the families that originally lived there, you see. So something has to be done if you want to promote either class integration or race integration, something has to be done to minimize this displacement. And, certain neighborhoods have tried different things, around the country, like property tax abatements for homeowners, encouraging developers to build mixed income housing. And another thing is, particularly in these neighborhoods that at one time were predominantly black, is that many of these neighborhoods have experienced depopulation. They're now many of them being rediscovered, but many of them experienced depopulation because, number one, the migration of blacks from the south to the north ended around 1970. And so in the previous years, you had significant numbers of blacks flowing in, replenishing neighborhoods. Secondly, you had the outmigration of non-poor families, non-poor black families and many white families from these neighborhoods. And then you also had the movement of industries, manufacturing industries out of these neighborhoods, creating depopulation, leading to abandoned buildings and vacant lots. I don't know about Atlanta, but I take you to a lot of cities, in inner city ghetto neighborhoods, and you see a number of abandoned buildings and vacant lots. Now, some of these neighborhoods are experiencing an in-migration of, particularly ones who are in the neighborhoods that are in desirable locations, are experiencing an in-migration of whites and higher income groups in those cities where the cost of housing is increasing. And in order to deal with the problems of gentrification, not only that lead to the displacement of lower income groups, not only do people talk about the development of mixed income housing and property tax abatements, but there's what we call community, I'm blocking on the name now. Yeah, community land trusts, right, thank you very much. Community land trusts, which are private, nonprofit organizations created to provide affordable land and housing for the residents in the neighborhood through the acquisition of vacant lands and then building properties, houses and other buildings on that land. And that has enabled many of these families to remain in such neighborhoods. First of all, you have to have certain conditions have to be present. The first condition is that the residents have the freedom to move if they don't like what's happening. If they have the freedom to move and you have an in-migration of an outside group, research suggests that once that population of the outside group reaches about 60%, that's it. The neighborhood's gone. Now, let us say that you have in-migration of outside groups. They begin to trickle in. and the residents in the neighborhood, let's say white residents, find it too difficult or expensive. Like, for example, Beltway, a lot of the whites had to stay there because they worked for the city, and it was a desirable neighborhood to live in. But they take some of these neighborhoods in New York and San Francisco, for example. Many whites cannot afford to move, so they stay. And the neighborhood becomes integrated. You may have some people moving in, but it's certainly not going to reach the tipping point, you see. Now you say, well, does this have any implications for federal policy? Can the government help us out here if the goal is to promote integration? Well, let me just say that a federal policy of rapid desegregation is a practical and political impossibility. Because as long as there are areas in which people can retreat, and indeed are able to retreat to areas where no minorities reside, it will be difficult to reduce the overall level of residential segregation. And in neighborhoods with low levels of social organization like Beltway, you can reach a tipping point very rapidly if those conditions are present. Now, perhaps it would be possible to stem this pattern if restrictions were placed on freedom of movement, or somehow it became very costly to move. But government restrictions on the freedom of movement in a democratic society would be both unrealistic and undesirable. And so given those situations, the process, such a situation, the process of neighborhood turnover can be very rapid, as it was in Dover. Now, is it possible down the road, I say in the book, I'm very pessimistic about the future, about achieving any meaningful integration of neighborhoods in American cities for all the reasons that I've stated in this lecture. But I suspect that you will see differences in the percentage of neighborhoods, the proportion of neighborhoods that are integrating. When you compare, say, New York and San Francisco with Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, these places. I haven't done any study of the of integration in suburbs, but I can tell you that the pattern that we see in urban areas also takes place in suburbs. A lot of the inner suburbs, which are really almost as bad as some of the inner city communities, used to be all white or predominantly white, and now many of these inner suburbs are now predominantly minorities. So the same process occurred. And also in other suburbs have changed from a white ethnic or white to black or other people of color. Same reason. So, urban areas are not unique in that respect. Our research team had long discussions with people, and they were quite clear. They said, look, we're getting out, first of all, because our friends have left. One woman, ran into another woman at a shopping store, and she says, hey, Ruth, are you still bowling? And she says, no, I'm not. All of my friends have left, you see. And so they feel lonely. That's one thing. The other thing is that they just fearful that the neighborhood is definitely going to turn over, and they don't want to live in a neighborhood with small percentage of white people. They just, that's what they said. And many of them said, that we don't think we can stem the tide. There's nothing we can do to change that. Now, that is quite different from the way that the residents of Beltway talked about it. The residents of Beltway say, we're going to stay here, we're going to fight, Beltway's the last stand, and they communicated that. The question is, Beltway has experienced an increase of Mexicans and also a symbolic increase of blacks, but my prediction is that Beltway will remain overwhelmingly white for the foreseeable future. It might be held up as a model of integration because you have a modicum, of integration, say 20, 25% of the residents being minority. Yes. One of the reasons that blacks were loyal to the neighborhood of Groveland was that the schools in that neighborhood were quite good. And if the schools deteriorated, I think that you would see a significant movement of blacks out of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood could tip over from middle class to lower class. So again, coming back to this goal of achieving meaningful integration, one way you can do that is to improve the schools in the neighborhood so that parents are more motivated to remain in the neighborhood. Thank you very much. In culture with social acts of honesty of men are more prolific by the customers of the range and more even the laws that are related critical phase support marks of these times. Issue I can make sure within the team and the marrying within the economy from the discuss plan recharging the secret and the information the minute for answers. Business speaks at work in a stated in drug by a rate on by water to salary. What they do to report what organs to do into the systems and speaking of people drop whether even energy for white water ways everything that is to resolve this was in for these organisms where we